I never expected to survive World War III. When the EMP hit Colorado State Penitentiary, I was just a prison electrician fixing circuits in the basement. Everything went dark. Tools dead. Security systems failed. Then the riots started. My name is Elijah Thorne, and this is how I survived 50 days of hell after civilization collapsed. I'll show you how prison taught me skills that kept me alive when everyone else was dying. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never expected to survive World War III. When the EMP hit Colorado State Penitentiary, I was just a prison electrician fixing circuits in the basement. Everything went dark. Tools dead. Security systems failed. Then the riots started. My name is Elijah Thorne, and this is how I survived 50 days of hell after civilization collapsed. I'll show you how prison taught me skills that kept me alive when everyone else was dying. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. April 16th, 2027. Just another Tuesday. I remember checking my watch at exactly 9:15 in the morning. I was down in the maintenance room at Colorado State Penitentiary, working on a faulty circuit breaker that kept tripping and cutting power to cell block D. The warden was breathing down my neck about it. "Fix it today, Thorne," he said. "I don't care what it takes." I'd been the head electrician there for 6 years. Before that, well, let's just say I've seen both sides of those prison bars. 3 years for a crime I didn't commit. That's a story for another time, but it taught me things. Important things. Things that would keep me alive when the world went to hell. I was elbow deep in the electrical panel when it happened. First, there was this weird sound, like air being sucked out of the room. Then a flash, bright enough to see even though I was 30 feet underground in a concrete box with no windows. My LED work light flickered once and died. The emergency lights didn't kick on. Every tool with a circuit board in my hands just stopped working. My first thought was that I'd screwed something up and blown the whole prison's electrical system. But my watch had stopped too. So had the backup generator that should have kicked in automatically. Even my phone was dead. Not just no signal, completely dead. I tried the wall-mounted phone. Nothing. The radio clipped to my belt. Dead. That's when I knew this was different. This wasn't just a power outage. In a maximum security prison, power isn't just about lights and air conditioning. It's about security. Electronic locks, surveillance cameras, communication systems. All down. I grabbed my manual tools and headed for the door, only to find it wouldn't open. The electronic lock had failed in the secured position. It took me 15 minutes to disassemble that door lock and get out. By then, the prison was in chaos. Guards were scrambling, inmates were shouting, and everyone was asking questions nobody had answers for. The warden found me in the hallway. His face was ashen. "Thorne, what the hell is going on? Why aren't the backups working?" "This isn't just us," I told him. "Something big happened. Maybe the whole grid is down." He didn't want to believe me, but a guard came running up with an old analog radio, one of those wind-up emergency types. The static-filled voice coming through was saying the same thing to anyone who could hear. "High-altitude electromagnetic pulse detected over North America. This is not a drill. All emergency personnel report to designated stations immediately." EMP. The thing preppers and conspiracy theorists had been warning about for decades. A high-altitude nuclear detonation designed not to destroy cities, but to fry electronics, to send us back to the 1800s in a flash of light. The warden pulled me and his senior guards into his office. The windows showed distant smoke rising from the direction of Denver. "Options," he demanded. I laid it out straight. "Most of our systems are fried. Circuit boards, computers, anything with modern electronics. Some simpler equipment might still work if we can get power to it, but our generators have electronic control systems too." "Can you fix any of it?" he asked. "Some. Maybe. Given time and parts. But if this was really an EMP, parts aren't coming anytime soon." That's when a guard named Reynolds spoke up. "Sir, what about the inmates? Without electronic locks, we're relying on the manual overrides. That's one guard per cell block, and we're understaffed as it is." The warden's face hardened. "We maintain order. We follow emergency protocols. No one goes in or out until we get word from higher up." I remember thinking how naive that sounded. Higher up? There was no higher up anymore. At least not one that could reach us. For the next few hours, I worked with what I had. I managed to jury-rig some basic lighting in critical areas using batteries from emergency exit signs and some LED strips I modified. It wasn't much, but it was something. By evening, things were deteriorating fast. Food was already becoming an issue. The kitchen ran on electricity, no power, no cooking. Water pressure was dropping as municipal pumping stations failed. Most concerning of all, the inmates knew something major had happened. They could see the guards' nervousness, the lack of information. I'd learned during my time on the inside how quick prisoners are to sense weakness. In any prison, there's a delicate balance of power. When that balance shifts, things get dangerous fast. Night fell, and with it came the first signs of serious trouble. Cell Block B, housing mostly violent offenders, had organized. They'd overwhelmed the single guard maintaining the manual locks and were attempting to access other sections of the prison. The warden called an emergency meeting. "We need the National Guard," he said, "but communications are down. I need 2 volunteers to drive to the nearest military base." No one jumped at the opportunity. Outside the prison walls, the world was an unknown. "I'll go," I finally said. Not out of courage, I just knew the prison was a ticking time bomb. I'd seen prison riots before, from the inside. When they happen, no one is safe. The warden shook his head. "No, Thorne. I need you here. You're the only one who might get some of our systems back online." That decision trapped me in what was about to become the most dangerous place in Colorado. But looking back, it also taught me my first survival lesson of the apocalypse. Specialized knowledge makes you valuable. Being valuable keeps you alive. As I lay on my cot that night listening to the growing unrest throughout the prison, I pulled out my notebook. It was filled with electrical diagrams, improvised device designs, and knowledge I'd gained both as an inmate and as staff. I had no idea then how crucial this notebook would become to my survival. I didn't sleep at all that first night. None of the staff did. We all knew what was coming. When the sun rose on day 1 of what would later be called the blackout, Colorado State Penitentiary was sitting on the edge of full-scale riot, and outside our walls, society was already beginning to crumble. Day 1 dawned with a strange silence. No alarm systems, no PA announcements, no humming of electricity. Just the growing voices of inmates demanding answers, food, and release. The 2 guards who'd volunteered to seek help hadn't returned. I suspected they never would. The warden gathered what staff remained in the administrative office. His confidence from the previous day had evaporated. "We need to reduce our population," he announced. "We don't have the resources or manpower to maintain everyone." His plan was to release non-violent offenders, about 1/3 of the prison population. Give them some supplies and send them on their way. The rest would remain locked down until help arrived. It was a desperate plan, but it made sense. Fewer inmates meant fewer mouths to feed, fewer potential rioters. I was assigned to help process the releases alongside a guard named Martinez. He was a good man, former military who treated inmates with respect. As we worked, he shared what little news he had. "My cousin's in the Air Force," he whispered. "Called in on an emergency frequency before communications went completely dark. Said it wasn't just us. China, Russia, half of Europe, all hit with EMPs. Then, the cyber attacks started. Banking systems, power grids, everything digital getting wiped out." "War?" I asked. "Not the kind with armies marching across borders. At least not yet. More like everybody hitting everybody else's infrastructure at once. Perfect storm. Perfect storm indeed." While we processed releases, I saw my first indication of just how bad things were outside. A National Guard truck arrived. Just one. Not the convoy we'd expected. The soldiers looked exhausted, their uniforms dirty. Their commanders spoke briefly with the warden while the rest distributed a meager amount of emergency supplies. I overheard fragments of their conversation. Denver was in chaos. Looting, fires, violence. The government was trying to maintain order, but with communications down and transportation disrupted, it was nearly impossible. The Guard was stretched thin, prioritizing critical infrastructure. What remained of it? They couldn't spare personnel for the prison. They suggested we release as many inmates as safely possible and hunker down with the rest. After they left, the warden aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He authorized the release of even more prisoners. Anyone not convicted of violent crimes or considered high risk. By midday, we'd cut our population by almost half. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt dread. The released inmates were heading into a world with no functioning infrastructure, no law enforcement, dwindling food supplies. Many would become desperate. Some would turn predatory. That night, the first serious violence erupted in Cell Block D. Two rival prison gangs, now confined in closer quarters after we consolidated the remaining inmates, turned on each other. By the time guards restored order, 3 inmates were dead and a guard was severely injured. The prison infirmary quickly became overwhelmed. Our medical supplies were limited even before the crisis. Now, with no resupply coming, the doctor was forced to ration everything. The injured guard, Jackson, I think his name was, died before morning from blood loss. We couldn't get him to a hospital. There probably weren't functioning hospitals anyway. Day 2 brought the first escape attempt. A group of inmates had been working on a section of fence since the EMP hit, using the reduced surveillance to their advantage. 5 got out before they were spotted. The guards didn't pursue them, they couldn't spare the manpower. I spent that day trying to restore some basic systems. I managed to get an old tube radio working. The technology was simple enough to survive an EMP. Through bursts of static, we picked up emergency broadcasts. The picture they painted was grim. The initial EMP attacks had been followed by limited nuclear strikes against military targets. Not city killers, but enough to throw radioactive material into the atmosphere. We were advised to stay indoors as much as possible, to filter water, to prepare for a long emergency. That night I made my decision. I had to leave. The prison was running out of food. Water pressure was nearly gone. The balance of power was shifting toward the inmates, who outnumbered staff significantly. It was only a matter of time before a full-scale riot broke out. I approached the warden in private. "I need to get to my apartment in Denver," I told him. "I have supplies there, tools, things that could help us." He knew it was an excuse to leave, but he also knew he couldn't stop me. I wasn't a guard or official staff. I was a contractor who'd been trapped by circumstance. "Take what you need," he said finally. "But Thorne, if you make it back, we'll be here." We both knew I wouldn't be back. I gathered what I could: my tools, some water, a makeshift weapon fashioned from a pipe. One of the inmates I'd befriended over the years, a man named Cisco serving 20 years for armed robbery, caught me as I was preparing to leave. "Take this," he said, slipping me a small blade, "and remember what I taught you about locks." During my 3 years inside, Cisco had shown me how to pick virtually any mechanical lock. I'd returned the favor by helping him understand electrical systems. He'd dreamed of becoming an electrician after his release. "Watch yourself out there," he added. "The world's full of desperate people now." I left before dawn on day 3, slipping out through a service entrance I'd modified. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of distant fires. From the hill above the prison, I looked back one last time. It looked oddly peaceful from the outside, a concrete fortress in the early morning light. I knew the chaos brewing within its walls. Part of me felt guilty for abandoning the staff who'd treated me decently. The rest of me knew staying meant certain death. My apartment was 30 miles away in Denver. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an easy drive. Now it meant a journey on foot through a landscape transformed by crisis. I stuck to back roads, avoiding the highway. A smart move, as it turned out. The highways were clogged with abandoned vehicles, some with bodies still inside. People had fled the cities en masse when things got bad, only to be stranded when their vehicles stopped working. Modern cars are full of electronics, perfect victims for an EMP. The few functioning vehicles I saw were older models, 70s, 80s, early 90s. Simple engines without computerized components. Their owners guarded them jealously, often with visible weapons. I kept my distance. By midday, I'd covered maybe 10 miles. The sun was unusually bright, reflecting off metal and glass from abandoned cars. I was rationing my water carefully, but already I could feel thirst building. I needed to find more supplies if I was going to make it all the way to Denver. Around midday on that third day, I came across a small strip mall. Most of the stores had already been looted, windows smashed, shelves emptied. But there was a bike shop tucked between a nail salon and a sandwich place that didn't look as thoroughly picked over. The front door was secure, but I remembered what Cisco had taught me about locks. 2 minutes with my improvised tools, and I was in. The high-end bikes were gone, but in the back workshop, I found something better. An old steel-frame bicycle that had been in for repairs. Nothing fancy, no electronic components, just solid engineering. It had a rack over the rear wheel where I could strap my tools and supplies. That bike changed everything. Suddenly, Denver wasn't a multi-day journey. It was achievable by nightfall. As I pushed westward, the landscape became increasingly ominous. Smoke rose from several locations in Denver's skyline. Twice I had to dive into ditches as military convoys passed. They weren't stopping for civilians. They had their missions, and whatever they were, they took priority over helping people stranded on the roads. I understood their position. When systems fail, you protect critical infrastructure first. Power stations, water treatment plants, communication hubs, government facilities. Individual citizens are on their own until the bigger problems are solved. That's the cold reality of disaster response. I just hadn't expected to be on the receiving end of that calculus. By late afternoon, I approached the eastern suburbs of Denver. The increased population density brought new dangers. People were gathering in groups, some seemingly organized, others just desperate clusters of neighbors. I kept my distance, sticking to side streets, moving quickly and quietly. At one intersection, I saw my first real evidence of how quickly society can break down. A grocery store was being emptied by a crowd while 3 police officers watched helplessly from their cruiser. They were outnumbered 50 to 1. Even with their weapons, they couldn't control the situation. The thin veneer of civilization was already peeling away, revealing the survival instinct beneath. I reached my apartment building as the sun was setting. From the outside, it looked intact, which gave me hope. That hope died as soon as I entered the lobby. The front security door had been forced open. The mailboxes were pried apart, contents scattered across the floor. Someone had started a small fire in the center of the lobby, perhaps for light or warmth. My apartment was on the 4th floor. With no working elevators, I carried my bike up the stairs. Each landing told a story. Doors broken open, belongings scattered, signs of hasty departures or violent entries. My floor seemed quieter. Maybe it had already been picked clean. Maybe the looters hadn't made it this high yet. Either way, I moved cautiously. My door was still locked. Another small mercy. Inside, everything was as I'd left it that Monday morning when I headed to work at the prison. It felt like entering a museum exhibit of normal life, a life that no longer existed. I worked quickly, gathering essentials. My emergency kit with first aid supplies, a hand crank radio and flashlight, non-perishable food, water bottles, tools, batteries, my notebook with electrical diagrams and designs, a photo of my grandfather, the only family I'd ever really known. While packing, I heard movement in the hallway. Multiple people, not trying to be quiet. I doused my light and waited, knife in hand. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Then came the knock. "We know you're in there. We saw the light. We just want to talk." I stayed silent. "Look, man, it's Thompson from 4C. We're organizing the building residents. Safety in numbers. Open up." I knew Thompson vaguely. Friendly enough guy, worked in finance or something. But I also knew how quickly people change when resources become scarce. "I'm good," I called through the door. "Thanks." A different voice now, harder. "Nobody's good on their own anymore. Open the door, or we'll open it for you." In prison, I'd learned to recognize genuine threats. This was one. They needed whatever supplies I had. I had seconds to decide. I grabbed my pack and headed for the fire escape through my bedroom window. As I climbed down, I heard my apartment door splintering. By the time they realized I was gone, I was already on my bike, pedaling away in the gathering darkness. That night, I slept in the back room of an auto repair shop a few miles away. The steel security door kept me safe while I planned my next move. Denver was clearly becoming too dangerous. The population density meant resources would be depleted faster, competition would be fiercer. I needed to get out of the city, find somewhere more sustainable. But first, I needed better transportation. The bike was good for now, but Colorado winters are harsh. I needed something that could handle rough terrain and carry more supplies, something that could either survive an EMP or be modified to work without sensitive electronics. The repair shop provided both shelter and opportunity. In the morning, I discovered a maintenance shed behind the main building that contained an old Honda motorcycle from the early 1980s. Simple, carbureted engine. No electronic fuel injection or computerized components. It needed work, new spark plugs, oil change, air filter, but the parts were right there in the shop. By midday on the 4th day, I had a functioning motorcycle and enough fuel siphoned from abandoned cars to travel a couple hundred miles. I also had a growing sense of the new reality. This wasn't a temporary crisis that would be resolved in days or weeks. The world had fundamentally changed. The old systems weren't coming back anytime soon. As I prepared to leave Denver, I heard the first unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, buzzing overhead. Military models from their sound and size. They flew in formation toward the city center. Reconnaissance, probably. Assessing damage, looking for gatherings of people, perhaps identifying resources for recovery efforts. I instinctively hid from their cameras. My years in prison had taught me to avoid official attention. Sometimes help from authorities comes with strings attached, strings that can become chains if you're not careful. That paranoia saved my life more than once in the following weeks. Because while some military and government forces were genuinely trying to help, others were simply securing resources and strategic positions, treating civilians as either assets to be controlled or obstacles to be removed. As night fell on that fourth day, I made my final preparations to leave the city. My destination wasn't clear yet, but the direction was away from population centers, toward the rural areas where people might be more self-sufficient, where the absence of complex infrastructure might be less catastrophic. Before sleep, I thumbed through my notebook one last time. Beyond the diagrams and technical notes were designs I'd been working on for years. Small-scale power systems that could be built from salvaged parts, water purification methods, security systems that required minimal power. In the old world, they were interesting projects, intellectual exercises. In this new world, they might be the difference between life and death. I didn't know it then, but that notebook would become the most valuable thing I owned. Not just for my survival, but eventually for an entire community. I left Denver at dawn on the fifth day. The city skyline behind me was barely visible through a haze of smoke. I'd modified the motorcycle with saddlebags made from backpacks to carry my supplies, tools, food, water, first aid kit, and most importantly, my notebook of electrical designs. The highways were death traps, clogged with abandoned vehicles and desperate people. Instead, I followed the power line service roads. Years working as an electrician taught me that these service roads often parallel major routes, but remain largely unknown to the general public. They're typically gravel or dirt, maintained just well enough for utility trucks to access transmission towers, perfect for avoiding crowds. About 20 miles outside of Denver, I encountered my first military checkpoint. National Guard, set up at a critical junction where a main road crossed with the service route I was following. They were stopping everyone, checking IDs, asking questions about where people were coming from and headed to. Some civilians were being turned back toward the city, others were being directed to what the soldiers called emergency civilian shelters. I cut the motorcycle engine and observed from a distance, hidden behind a maintenance shed. My prison-honed instincts told me to avoid official registration of any kind. In a crisis, bureaucracy can quickly turn to control. Once you're in their system, you're subject to their priorities, which might not align with your survival. After watching for an hour, I identified a gap in their perimeter, a drainage culvert that ran under the road about 100 yards from their position. I pushed the motorcycle through with its engine off, then continued on foot until I was well clear before starting it again. By midday, I'd put considerable distance between myself and Denver. The landscape opened up, residential areas giving way to scattered farms and open country. I began looking for somewhere to rest and refuel both myself and the bike. An abandoned gas station appeared promising until I spotted fresh tire tracks in the gravel lot. Someone was there, or had been recently. I circled the building cautiously, noting a pickup truck parked behind the station. It was an old model Ford, probably from the late 70s, simple enough to survive the EMP. I was debating whether to approach or move on when the decision was made for me. The unmistakable sound of a shotgun being racked came from behind the building. "That's far enough," a man's voice called out. "State your business." I raised my hand slowly. "Just looking for supplies. I can move on." An older man stepped into view, shotgun trained on my chest. His weathered face and calloused hands marked him as someone accustomed to physical labor. A farmer, maybe, or a mechanic. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Denver. Left this morning." His eyes narrowed. "How bad is it there?" "Bad and getting worse. No power, no water, people getting desperate." He lowered the shotgun slightly. "You military? Government?" number. I hesitated, then decided honesty might be my best approach. I was a prison electrician when it happened, got out before things fell apart completely. Something in my answer seemed to satisfy him. Perhaps it was specific enough to be believable, or perhaps he simply recognized another survivor trying to navigate this new reality. "Name's Frank," he said, lowering the shotgun completely. "Was making a supply run when my truck stalled. Battery's shot." I examined his truck. The battery was indeed dead, but not from the EMP. It was just old, corroded. A simple fix for someone with the right knowledge. "I can help with that," I offered. "I'm good with electrical systems." Frank's expression changed from suspicion to guarded interest. "You can get it running again." I nodded. "Got tools on my bike. Might be able to jump-start it enough to get you home, where I assume you have spares?" He did. Within an hour, I had his truck running again. In return, he offered me food. Real food, not the packaged stuff I'd been surviving on. We sat behind the gas station, eating in silence for a while before he spoke again. "Got a farm about 30 miles from here. Not a big operation, but self-sufficient. Solar panels for power, well, for water. Been that way for years. People called me paranoid." He gave a dry laugh. "Not so paranoid now, I guess." I understood immediately what he wasn't saying directly. He was offering me a place to stay, at least temporarily. A farm with working utilities in this new world was as valuable as gold. The fact that he would invite a stranger based on a simple mechanical repair showed either extreme generosity or desperate need. "You living there alone?" I asked. "Me and my daughter. Had a few farm hands, but they took off when the lights went out. Headed to the emergency shelters." His expression darkened. "Lot of work for two people." Ah, there it was. He needed labor. I needed shelter. A simple transaction in a world returning to simpler values. "I could help out for a while," I offered cautiously. "I'm handy with more than just car batteries." Frank studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see. You can ride along, stay the night at least. After that, we'll talk." We reached his farm by late afternoon. It was impressive. About 40 acres of cultivated land surrounded by open country. A 2-story farmhouse, several outbuildings, a small orchard. True to his word, there were solar panels on the roof of the main house and barn. A windmill pumped water from a well. Frank's daughter Sarah met us at the door. She was around 30, with her father's practical demeanor and suspicious gaze. She took in my presence with obvious disapproval. "We agreed no strangers, Dad," she said, ignoring me completely. "He fixed the truck," Frank replied, as if that explained everything. In a way, it did. Skills were the new currency. That night I slept in a real bed for the first time since the EMP. Clean sheets, quiet surroundings. It felt surreal after the chaos of the prison in Denver. But even in that comfort, I kept my pack ready and the motorcycle keys within reach. Trust was still a luxury I couldn't fully afford. In the morning, Frank showed me around the property. Their setup was impressive, but vulnerable. The solar system lacked proper battery storage. The well pump was inefficient. The perimeter had minimal security beyond distance from main roads. I saw opportunities to help, to improve their chances, and, by extension, my own. I began to sketch modifications in my notebook. Better power management, water filtration, perimeter alarms using simple tripwires and salvaged parts. When I showed Frank the designs, his eyes widened. "You can build all this?" "With the right materials, yes. Most of what we need could be salvaged from nearby properties." For the first time, I saw something like hope in the old farmer's face. "Then I think we might have a deal, Mr. Prison Electrician." and so began my time at the farm. Days stretched into a week as I worked to improve their systems while helping with daily chores. Sarah's initial distrust gradually softened as my improvements made their lives easier. A salvaged car alternator coupled to the windmill doubled their electricity production. A series of rainwater collectors supplemented the well. Simple alarm systems gave early warning of approaching vehicles. But isolation, while safer in some ways, brought its own problems. Without news, without connection to whatever remained of the world outside, we were operating blind. Were things improving, deteriorating further? Was help coming, or were we truly on our own now? We needed information, and on the 8th day, that need would drive us to a decision that would change everything. By the end of that first week, we had established a routine at the farm. Wake at sunrise, check the perimeter, tend to essential tasks, work on improvements until sunset, then lock down for the night. It was sustainable, but isolated. Our only connection to the outside world was Frank's ancient ham radio, which mostly produced static. Then, on the morning of the 8th day, Sarah picked up a transmission, a military broadcast repeating on a loop. Emergency centers were being established at major cities. Government continuity operations were underway. Citizens were advised to proceed to designated collection points for registration and assistance. "We should go," Sarah argued over breakfast. "They're organizing recovery efforts. We could help, be part of rebuilding." Frank shook his head. "They're centralizing resources. That means rationing, martial law eventually. We're better off here. Better off not knowing if there's medicine if one of us gets sick. Better off not knowing if they're restoring power or communications," Sarah countered. Their argument continued as I stayed silent, pondering our options. I'd spent years in a system that promised safety in exchange for freedom. The trade-off rarely favored the individual. "What do you think, Elijah?" Frank finally asked. I chose my words carefully. Information is valuable, but so is independence. Maybe we don't all go. Maybe just one of us, to scout. They both stared at me. Sarah spoke first. "You're volunteering?" I nodded. "I'm the most expendable here. It's your farm. And I'm used to navigating difficult situations." The decision was made. The next morning, I prepared the motorcycle for the journey to the nearest emergency center about 50 miles away in Boulder. Sarah provided me with a list of medical supplies to look for. Frank gave me a pistol. Neither asked if I knew how to use it. I didn't tell them I'd never fired a gun in my life. The journey to Boulder took longer than expected. Roads were increasingly blocked by abandoned vehicles, forcing lengthy detours. Twice I had to hide as groups of armed civilians passed by. Not military or police, just people who had decided that force was the new law. I reached the outskirts of Boulder by early afternoon. From a hilltop overlooking the city, I could see the emergency center, a university sports complex surrounded by military vehicles. Long lines of people waited outside, being processed in small groups. Armed soldiers patrolled the perimeter. I observed for hours, looking for patterns, evaluating the situation. People went in, but from my vantage point, no one seemed to come out. Supply trucks arrived regularly. Medical helicopters occasionally landed and departed. It looked organized, efficient. It also looked like a one-way trip. As evening approached, I moved closer, finding shelter in an abandoned home about half a mile from the facility. Through a pair of binoculars I'd found in the house, I could see more details. People were being sorted, families in one area, individuals in another. Some were loaded onto buses. Others were directed to tents within the complex. While watching, I noticed a man in civilian clothes exiting through a side gate. He wore some kind of badge and carried a clipboard. He walked with purpose toward a residential area. I followed discreetly, keeping my distance. He entered a house several blocks away. After 30 minutes, he emerged with 2 other people carrying bags. They headed back toward the complex. I made my decision then. This man might have information, and he was operating with some degree of freedom. I intercepted him on his return journey the next morning, approaching openly with my hands visible. "Excuse me, I need information about the emergency center." He stopped, suspicious but not immediately hostile. The badge on his chest identified him as FEMA Civilian Coordinator. "You should proceed to the main entrance for processing," he said automatically. "I'm not looking to be processed. I represent a small community outside the city. We're self-sufficient but need information. What's the situation? Is there a plan for restoring infrastructure?" He hesitated, then glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard. "Look, officially I'm supposed to direct everyone to registration. But off the record, things are complicated. The EMP damaged about 80% of the power grid. Military and essential services are the priority for restoration. Civilian sectors could be months, maybe years. And the people being processed? Most are being relocated to labor camps. I mean work centers. Agricultural projects, manufacturing, infrastructure repair. It's all voluntary technically, but if you can't support yourself independently, there aren't many options." He lowered his voice further. "Between us, if you have a functioning independent setup, stay there. These centers are for people who can't survive otherwise. The conditions aren't great, and individual freedoms are limited. It's about maximizing resource efficiency now." I thanked him and retreated before anyone else noticed our conversation. His confirmation of my suspicions sent me back to the motorcycle with new urgency. The emergency centers weren't about helping individual survivors. They were about consolidating human resources to rebuild critical systems. On my return journey, I encountered a new obstacle. A makeshift roadblock had been established on the main road back to Frank's farm. Not military, this was a civilian operation. Half a dozen armed men stopping travelers, demanding tolls for passage. I killed the motorcycle engine and observed from a distance. They were stopping everyone, taking fuel, supplies, even forcing some travelers to turn back. One man who resisted was beaten severely while the others watched. The old prison mantra echoed in my mind. Avoid conflict when possible. Be decisive when necessary. I backtracked and found an alternative route, adding hours to my journey but avoiding a potentially deadly confrontation. When I finally returned to the farm, Frank and Sarah were waiting anxiously. I shared everything I'd learned. The government's focus on essential infrastructure, the relocation of survivors to work centers, the deteriorating security situation on the roads. "So we're on our own," Frank said finally. It wasn't a question. "For now," I confirmed, "but we're not the only ones. There will be other independent groups, other people with skills and resources. Eventually, new networks will form." That night, we made plans. The farm was relatively secure, but we needed to prepare for a longer period of isolation than originally anticipated. We expanded our list of necessary improvements: better security, expanded food production, more efficient power systems. We also discussed the possibility of connecting with other survivors. Strength in numbers, but only with the right people. Those with complementary skills, similar values. Building a community would be essential for long-term survival. The next morning, Sarah approached me privately. "I'm sorry, I pushed to contact the authorities. You were right about them." I shook my head. "No one's right or wrong here. We're all just trying to survive. And information is never wasted, even if it's not what we hoped to hear." As I worked on reinforcing the barn door that day, a new sound caught my attention. Vehicles approaching along the main road. Multiple engines. Frank appeared beside me, rifle in hand. Sarah took position at an upstairs window with binoculars. 3 trucks, she called down. Armed men, not military. Frank's expression hardened. Raiders. They've been hitting isolated properties, taking whatever they want. I thought quickly. How long until they reach the main gate? 5 minutes? Maybe less. 5 minutes to prepare a defense against unknown numbers with superior firepower. The farm had decent natural protection, long sight lines, limited approach vectors, but we were just 3 people. We needed an advantage. I ran to the workshop where I'd been tinkering with various electrical projects. Among them was a system I'd designed to power the electric fence using car batteries. It wasn't meant as a weapon, just a deterrent for wildlife and trespassers. But with some quick modifications, I could significantly increase the voltage. Not lethal, but definitely incapacitating. If we could funnel them toward it, we might stand a chance. "Frank, Sarah," I called out, "I have an idea, but I need you to trust me, and I need 2 minutes." They looked at each other, then at me. Frank nodded. 2 minutes. Then we do this my way. I worked frantically, connecting additional batteries in series, bypassing safety limiters. It was dangerous, reckless even, but the approaching threat left no room for caution. As the trucks came into view on the long driveway, I finished my preparations. Now, we just needed to implement the plan and hope it worked. Our lives depended on it. "Frank, I need you to move your truck across the main driveway, blocking it partially. Leave just enough room for 1 vehicle to pass," I instructed. "They'll have to slow down to navigate around it." Sarah positioned herself in the hay loft with Frank's hunting rifle, while I connected the final wires to our makeshift defense system. I'd repurposed the electric fence charger, amplifying its output by connecting it to multiple car batteries in series. The voltage was now high enough to temporarily incapacitate without killing. At least that was the theory. I strung conductive wire across the narrowest point of the driveway, camouflaging it with dirt and gravel, then connected it to the modified charger. When triggered, it would deliver a powerful shock to any vehicle passing over it, temporarily disabling its occupants. The raiders arrived exactly as expected. 3 pickup trucks filled with armed men. Their confidence was evident in their approach. No attempt at stealth, engines roaring as they sped up the driveway toward the farmhouse. The lead truck slowed as the driver spotted Frank's vehicle partially blocking the path. Just as they began to navigate around it, I hit the switch. The effect was instantaneous. Electricity surged through the hidden wire, into the truck's chassis, and through every person touching metal inside. The driver convulsed, losing control, and the truck veered off the driveway into a drainage ditch. The second truck slammed on its brakes to avoid collision, exactly where I'd hoped they would stop. Frank opened fire from his position behind the water trough, aiming not at the men but at the truck's radiator and tires. Within seconds, steam erupted from under the hood as coolant sprayed from bullet holes. The third truck began to reverse, its occupants realizing they'd driven into an ambush. Sarah's shot shattered their windshield, forcing them to abandon the vehicle and take cover behind it. "We don't want trouble," I shouted from behind the barn door. "Take your wounded and leave. There's nothing here worth dying for." There was a tense silence, then a voice called back. "We're just looking for supplies. Food, medicine, fuel. We're desperate." "So is everyone," Frank responded. "Find another way to survive that doesn't involve stealing from others." More silence. Then movement as they began collecting their stunned companions from the first truck. Some could walk, others had to be carried. The shock had been more powerful than I'd anticipated. I felt a twinge of guilt watching them struggle, but reminded myself that they had come armed, prepared to take by force. They retreated slowly, half carrying their disabled members. One man, apparently their leader, paused to look back at us. "This isn't over," he called. "There are more of us than you." "And we'll be better prepared next time," Frank answered calmly. We maintained our positions until they disappeared from sight, then spent the rest of the day reinforcing our defenses. I expanded the electric trap system to cover all potential approaches. Frank moved additional vehicles to create choke points. Sarah established communication signals in case we became separated during a future attack. That night, gathered around the table for a simple dinner, the reality of our situation sank in. The raiders would return, likely with greater numbers. We had repelled them once through surprise and preparation, but we couldn't count on the same advantages again. "We need more people," Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. "3 of us can't defend this place indefinitely." Frank nodded reluctantly. "But we can't just take in anyone. We need the right people, people with skills, who understand what we're building here." I thought of the prison, how carefully balanced the social ecosystem had been before the EMP. In any group, roles needed to be clear, contributions valued, leadership respected. We weren't just looking for warm bodies, we needed to build a community. "I might know where to start," I said. On my way back from Boulder, I passed a small medical clinic. There were people inside. I saw movement, lights from what looked like oil lamps. Medical professionals would be invaluable. The next morning, Sarah and I set out to make contact with the clinic while Frank stayed to guard the farm. We traveled cautiously, taking back roads, alert for any sign of the raiders or other threats. The clinic was a small rural facility, the kind that serves farming communities too far from major hospitals. From our observation point in a grove of trees nearby, we could see it had been fortified. Windows boarded up, improvised barriers around the perimeter, a watchman on the roof. "How do we approach without getting shot?" Sarah whispered. "Openly, visibly unarmed." I removed my jacket and raised it on a stick, waving it slowly as we emerged from cover. The watchman spotted us immediately, raising a rifle but not firing. He called down to someone inside, and soon a woman emerged, medical bag in hand. She approached cautiously, stopping about 20 feet away. "What do you want?" she asked. "To talk." "Maybe trade," I responded. "We have a secure location, sustainable power. We're looking to connect with others who have skills we need." She studied us skeptically. "I'm Dr. Chen. This was my clinic before. Now it's shelter for my staff and some patients who couldn't be moved when the hospitals evacuated." Sarah stepped forward. "We have food, clean water, solar power, but we need medical expertise. We recently had trouble with raiders." Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly at the mention of raiders. "We've had similar problems. They've tried twice now. We're running low on supplies for defense." The conversation continued, gradually warming as trust built. Dr. Chen had 3 nurses and an EMT with her, along with 7 patients of varying conditions. They had medicine but limited food. Their generator had failed days ago, and they were operating with minimal light and no refrigeration for critical medications. By midday, we had the outline of an agreement. They would relocate to the farm, bringing their medical supplies and expertise. We would provide security, power, and sustainable food. But Dr. Chen was clear. Her patients came first. Non-negotiable. "We'll need transportation," she said. "Some of my patients can't walk far." I thought of Frank's truck and my motorcycle. Not enough, but I might know where we can find something suitable. On our way back to the farm, I explained my plan to Sarah. About 5 miles from the farm was a small volunteer fire station. Rural, likely overlooked in the chaos. They might have vehicles, ambulances or rescue trucks, with simple enough systems to still function after the EMP. "It's worth checking," Sarah agreed. But we should move quickly. Once Dr. Chen and her people are ready, we don't want to leave them waiting. We returned to the farm to find Frank working on expanding the solar array. He listened to our report with cautious optimism. Doctors are good. We need medical knowledge. But 11 new people all at once? That's a lot of mouths to feed. It's a lot of hands to work, too, I countered, and a lot of eyes to watch for threats. Frank eventually agreed, and the next morning, he and I set out to investigate the fire station while Sarah prepared space for our new community members. Our small farm was about to become something more, a foundation for rebuilding, not just surviving. But as we approached the fire station, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud. Someone had been here recently. We proceeded with greater caution, weapons ready. The large bay doors of the station were closed, but a side door stood ajar. Frank signaled for me to cover him as he approached. He peered inside, then gestured for me to join him. The interior was dim, but I could make out the shapes of vehicles, an ambulance and a fire truck, and something else, the unmistakable silhouette of a person moving in the shadows. "Who's there?" Frank called out, his rifle raised. "Show yourself slowly." The figure froze, then raised their hands. "Don't shoot. I'm alone." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could make out a young man, perhaps early 20s, wearing what remained of a firefighter's uniform. His face was streaked with grime, his eyes wary but not hostile. "I'm Jason," he said. "I was on duty when it happened. Been here ever since." Frank kept his rifle trained on the young man while I checked the rest of the building. It appeared he was telling the truth. No one else was inside. The fire station was small, just 2 bays with the ambulance and fire truck, plus living quarters and a modest supply room. "You've been here alone for 3 weeks?" I asked, returning to where Frank still stood guard. Jason nodded. Most of the crew went to check on their families when communications went down. They never came back. I stayed because, well, this was my post, and I didn't have anyone to go home to anyway. There was something in his voice, a mix of duty and loneliness, that rang true. I glanced at Frank, who slightly lowered his weapon. "We're looking for transportation," I explained. "We need to move some people, doctors and patients, to a safer location." Jason's expression brightened. "Doctors? Real doctors. The ambulance works. It's old, no computerized systems. I've been maintaining it, keeping the battery charged with a hand crank." Frank and I exchanged looks. This was an unexpected stroke of luck. "You're a mechanic?" I asked. "Volunteer firefighter and mechanic by trade," Jason confirmed. "I've been trying to keep both vehicles operational, hoping someone would come who could use them." Over the next hour, we explained our situation, the farm, Dr. Chen's clinic, our plan to combine resources. Jason listened intently, occasionally asking practical questions about defense, supplies, and organization. "I want to come with you," he said finally. "I've got skills, mechanical repair, emergency medical training, firefighting, and these vehicles need someone who knows how to maintain them." Frank pulled me aside for a quick conference. "What do you think?" "His skills would be valuable," I admitted. "And he's been protecting this place alone. Shows dedication, resourcefulness." "Could be a trap," Frank countered. "For what purpose?" "If he wanted to harm us, he could have ambushed us when we entered. And we can check the vehicles for sabotage before we commit." After thorough inspection of both the ambulance and Jason's story, we decided to bring him into our group. His knowledge of the vehicles alone was worth the risk, and his emergency medical training would complement Dr. Chen's team. By mid-afternoon, we had a plan. Jason would drive the ambulance to the clinic with me, while Frank returned to the farm to prepare for everyone's arrival. The fire truck would remain at the station for now, a potential resource for later use. The drive to the clinic was tense. Twice we had to navigate around roadblocks or abandoned vehicles. Once we detoured to avoid a group of armed men searching houses in a small residential area. But the ambulance, with its distinctive profile, seemed to deter direct confrontation. Even in this new world, emergency vehicles commanded a certain respect. Dr. Chen was surprised but pleased by our arrival. An ambulance? That's better than I'd hoped for. Loading her patients took time. 2 could walk with assistance, 3 needed to be carried on stretchers, and 2 were relatively mobile but elderly and slow. The ambulance was crowded but adequate. Medical supplies filled every remaining space. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Chen pulled me aside. "There's something you should know. One of my patients, the older man with the beard, he has specialized knowledge. He was a power plant engineer, worked at the nuclear facility near Fort Collins. If you're serious about rebuilding, he might be invaluable." This information electrified me. My electrical knowledge was practical, focused on smaller systems. A power plant engineer would understand large-scale generation, distribution networks, grid management, exactly what would be needed for true recovery. The return journey to the farm was slow and cautious. We avoided main roads and traveled with headlights off when possible, navigating by moonlight. Jason proved to be a skilled driver, finding paths I wouldn't have attempted with the bulky ambulance. We arrived at the farm shortly after midnight. Sarah had prepared the main house and a converted barn for our new community members. Dr. Chen immediately set to work establishing an infirmary in what had been Frank's study. By dawn, our population had grown from 3 to 15. The dynamics changed instantly. Where before decisions had been simple 3-way discussions, now we had multiple voices, priorities, and needs. I found Frank sitting on the porch, watching the sunrise as the others slept. "Having second thoughts?" I asked. He sighed. "Not second thoughts. Just realizing how much has changed. This isn't just survival anymore. We're building something." He was right. In just 3 weeks, we'd gone from individuals in crisis to the foundation of a community. Each person brought skills, knowledge, and needs. Managing those elements would require more than just goodwill. It would need structure, organization, rules. Dr. Chen joined us, coffee mug in hand. "We need to discuss integration, medical needs, work distribution, decision-making processes." "A council," I suggested. "Representatives for different aspects of our community. Security, medical, food production, technical systems." Frank nodded slowly. "Makes sense, but we also need to address the threat those raiders pose. They'll find us eventually, especially now with more people and vehicles coming and going." Dr. Chen's expression was grim. "Before the clinic, I was at Boulder Community Hospital. I saw what happened when the military pulled out and left civilians to fend for themselves. Those raiders aren't just opportunists. They're organized, probably led by someone with tactical experience. They're establishing territory." This was concerning news. We weren't just dealing with desperate individuals, but a competing power structure, one likely better armed and more numerous than our fledgling community. "We need better intelligence," I said. "We need to know their numbers, base of operations, patterns. We can't defend against a threat we don't understand." "Reconnaissance," Frank agreed. "But careful, distant observation only. No contact." I volunteered immediately. My experience at the prison had taught me how to observe without being seen, how to read patterns in group behavior, how to identify hierarchies and weaknesses. The next day, equipped with binoculars, emergency rations, and Frank's old hunting rifle, I set out on the motorcycle. My mission was simple: locate the raiders' base, estimate their numbers and resources, then return with information. I didn't expect to find them so quickly, or to discover something that would change our entire strategy. About 15 miles from the farm, following reports from Dr. Chen about where raiders had been spotted, I found their compound, a former truck stop with attached motel. The location was strategic: access to the highway, multiple buildings for shelter, large fuel tanks that might still contain diesel. I observed from a wooded hillside half a mile away. Through the binoculars, I counted at least 20 individuals moving around the compound. Vehicles, mostly trucks and a few motorcycles, weapons were evident. They had erected a perimeter fence using vehicles and debris. But what caught my attention was their power. Lights were visible in some buildings. They had electricity, which meant generators or some other power source. In this new world, power was perhaps the most valuable resource of all. As evening approached, I prepared to return with my findings. That's when I saw him, the leader, judging by how others deferred to him. He emerged from the main building, issuing orders to various groups. I adjusted the binoculars for a better look and felt my blood freeze. I recognized him immediately, though he'd lost weight and grown a beard. Officer Reynolds, from the prison, the guard who'd been most vocal about releasing prisoners when the EMP hit. He must have abandoned the prison after I left, perhaps leading some inmates with him. That explained the organization, the tactical approach. Reynolds had been former military before becoming a guard. He knew security, strategy, weapons. He also knew me, and if he recognized me, he would know about my electrical skills. That would make our farm an even more tempting target. I retreated carefully, mind racing with implications. This wasn't just about defending against raiders anymore. This was personal, complicated by shared history and knowledge. Reynolds would recognize the work I'd done at the farm if he saw it. My electrical modifications had a signature as distinctive as handwriting. Returning to the farm, I shared everything except Reynolds' identity. That knowledge felt too volatile, too personal. I needed time to process what it meant, to formulate a strategy that accounted for this new dimension. As our council meeting broke up, each member heading off to manage their area of responsibility, Dr. Chen's power plant engineer approached me. His name was Howard, and though weakened by recent illness, his mind remained sharp. "I understand you've been working on our electrical systems," he said. "I'd like to see what you've done. Perhaps I can offer some insights." That conversation would prove to be a turning point, not just for our power systems, but for our entire approach to survival in this new world. Howard examined my electrical setups with the meticulous attention of someone who had spent decades working with power systems. He traced connections, checked my improvised safety measures, and studied the load distribution I'd implemented. When he finished, he nodded approvingly. "Impressive work with limited resources," he said. "But I think we can do better. Much better." Over the next few days, Howard and I worked closely together, combining my practical skills with his theoretical knowledge. He explained concepts I'd only partially understood before: load balancing, phase synchronization, the intricacies of AC versus DC systems. In return, I showed him how to improvise with available materials, how to repurpose components never meant for electrical use. "The real limitation isn't generation," Howard explained. "Between your solar setup and wind capture, we can produce enough power for basic needs. The problem is storage and distribution." He sketched a design for an improved battery bank using salvaged car batteries wired in a specific configuration to maximize capacity while minimizing loss. We would need more batteries, at least 20 additional units, plus heavy-gauge copper wire, charge controllers, and inverters. "There's a battery warehouse about 30 miles from here," Howard said. "It supplied automotive shops throughout the region. If it hasn't been completely looted, we could find everything we need." The council approved the expedition. Jason volunteered to drive, and Sarah insisted on coming as additional security. I was designated as the technical expert to identify what we needed. We would take the fire truck. Its size would allow us to transport large quantities of batteries and equipment. We set out at dawn, armed and prepared for potential confrontation. The warehouse was located in an industrial park that had likely been overlooked by most scavengers focusing on food, medicine, and weapons. Battery distribution wasn't an obvious survival priority unless you understood their potential as Howard did. The journey was tense but uneventful until we approached the industrial park. From half a mile away, we could see the problem. A section of the park was occupied, vehicles parked in a defensive formation, people moving with purpose. Another group of survivors had claimed this territory. "We should turn back," Sarah whispered as we observed from a distance. I studied the layout through binoculars. "Not necessarily. Look at what they're using. The food processing plant, the tool manufacturer. They haven't touched the battery warehouse. It's on the far side, partially hidden by those larger buildings." "So what's the plan?" Jason asked. "We can't just drive up in a fire truck and start loading batteries." He was right. We needed stealth, not a direct approach. We circle around, approach from the rear access road. The warehouse likely has loading docks on both sides. We get in, get what we need, and leave before they notice. The plan worked initially. We found the rear entrance unguarded, the security door already broken from previous looters. Inside, the warehouse was a treasure trove of exactly what we needed. Rows of batteries in various sizes, spools of copper wire, electrical components of all kinds. We worked quickly, loading essential items into the fire truck. The batteries were heavy, requiring all three of us to move them safely. We had filled perhaps half the available space when we heard vehicles approaching. "Company," Sarah whispered, peering through a dirty window. "3 trucks, coming fast." We had moments to decide: abandon our valuable haul and hide, or risk confrontation to save it. The decision was made for us when the trucks pulled directly up to the loading dock where our fire truck was parked. "They must have spotted it," Jason muttered. There was no time to move the vehicle or fully hide our presence. I made a rapid calculation and chose our best option. "Jason, get in your turnout gear. Sarah, hide among the shelves, but keep us covered. I'll do the talking." Jason caught on immediately, donning his firefighter uniform as I positioned myself near the loading dock. When the newcomers entered, 5 armed men, I was waiting. "Fire department salvage operation," I called out confidently. "Official recovery of emergency equipment." The leader, a hard-faced man with a military-style haircut, studied me suspiciously. Didn't know the fire department was still functioning. "Essential services reconstruction," I replied vaguely. "We're restoring emergency response capabilities in designated zones." It was bureaucratic doublespeak, designed to sound official without providing actual information. A technique I'd learned from prison administrators who excelled at saying nothing with many words. The man seemed uncertain, his weapon neither raised nor lowered. "Who authorized this?" Before I could respond, Jason emerged in full firefighter gear, adding credibility to our charade. "We need to keep moving, Chief. Command wants us back before sunset." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Command? You're working with the military restoration forces?" I seized the opening. "We're not authorized to discuss operational details, but I suggest you avoid interfering with official recovery efforts. It tends to complicate things." The implied threat worked. These men had established their own power structure here, but they clearly feared a larger, more organized force reasserting control. After a tense moment, the leader stepped back. "Take what you need for official purposes," he said carefully. "We're supportive of restoration efforts." We continued loading under their watchful eyes, taking only what Howard had specified. nothing more that might suggest personal scavenging rather than official recovery. When finished, we departed with deliberate professionalism, maintaining the illusion until well out of sight. "That was too close," Sarah said once we were safely away, "but brilliant thinking with the official recovery story." "People still respect authority or fear it," I explained. "They want to believe someone's in charge, that order will return. We use that to our advantage." With our valuable cargo secured, we returned to the farm where Howard was waiting eagerly. The supplies we'd gathered would transform our electrical system from basic survival to genuine infrastructure, enough power to run critical medical equipment, refrigeration for food preservation, even limited communications if we could repair the ham radio. As we unloaded, Frank pulled me aside. "While you were gone, we had a visitor. Single man, said he was just passing through looking for supplies. We gave him some food, let him rest, then sent him on his way." Something in Frank's tone alerted me. "What aren't you telling me?" He asked a lot of questions about our power, our defenses, said he was impressed by our setup, asked specifically who designed our electrical systems. My stomach tightened. What did he look like? Frank described him, the right height, build, and age to be one of Reynolds's men. A scout, probably. They'd found us. I finally told Frank everything, about recognizing Reynolds, about my history with him at the prison. Frank listened silently, his expression growing darker. "So they know about you, about your skills, and now they likely know you're here." I nodded grimly. "They'll come. Not immediately. Reynolds is too smart for that. He'll gather intelligence first, assess our strengths and weaknesses, plan carefully." "How much time do we have?" "Days, maybe a week. Long enough to prepare if we start now." That night, we called an emergency council meeting. I explained the threat without hiding any details. If we were going to defend our community, everyone needed to understand what we were facing. "Doctor," Chen spoke first after I finished. "We can't abandon this place. We have patients who can't be moved easily, systems we've built that can't be relocated." "And where would we go?" Howard added. "This farm offers advantages we won't find elsewhere. Isolation, natural resources, defensive positioning." One by one, each member of our growing community voiced the same conclusion. We would stay and defend our home. The question wasn't whether to fight, but how. I shared my plan, drawing on everything I'd learned, both in prison and in the weeks since the EMP. Reynolds thinks like a tactician. He'll expect conventional defenses, barricades, armed positions, maybe some basic traps. We need to give him something completely unexpected. Using Howard's expertise and the materials we'd salvaged, I proposed a defense strategy based not on direct confrontation, but on electromagnetic countermeasures, systems that would disable their vehicles, interfere with their communications, confuse their approach. "We can't match their numbers or weaponry," I explained, "but we can fight asymmetrically, using their dependence on technology against them." As the others discussed details, I stepped outside for air. The night was clear, stars visible in a way they never had been before the EMP, when light pollution obscured the sky. I pulled out my notebook, flipping through designs and diagrams, adding new notes based on Howard's insights. A particular design caught my attention, something I'd sketched months before the EMP as a theoretical exercise. With modifications, incorporating what we'd learned about electromagnetic effects, it might be exactly what we needed now. I turned to a fresh page and began drawing rapidly, creating the blueprint for a device that might save all our lives. By morning, I'd have a prototype ready to test. By the time Reynolds arrived, we'd be prepared with a defense he could never anticipate. As I worked through the night, one thought kept me focused. Everything I'd experienced, my wrongful imprisonment, my work at the prison, even the EMP itself, had prepared me for this moment. Each hardship had taught me skills I now needed. Perhaps there was purpose in it all, a reason I had survived when so many hadn't. Dawn approached, and with it came renewed determination. We wouldn't just survive Reynolds' attack, we would establish ourselves as a force to be reckoned with in this new world. A community worth protecting, worth building upon. A seed of restoration in a devastated landscape. The device I designed combined principles of electromagnetic interference with simple mechanical triggers. We called it the disruptor. Using salvaged capacitors, copper wire, and powerful magnets arranged in a specific configuration, it could generate a localized EMP effect when triggered, not powerful enough to fry equipment at a distance like the original attack, but strong enough to disable any vehicle or electronic device within 20 yards. Howard helped refine the design, providing critical insights about power requirements and field propagation. Jason contributed his mechanical expertise, creating reliable triggering mechanisms. Even Dr. Chen's knowledge proved valuable. She suggested using medical equipment capacitors for greater energy storage capacity. We built 3 disruptors over the next 2 days, positioning them at strategic points around the farm perimeter. Each was carefully camouflaged and connected to tripwires that would activate them when vehicles passed. The beauty of the design was its simplicity. Once triggered, there was no countering its effects. Any vehicle caught in the field would simply stop working. But the disruptors were only part of our defense strategy. We divided our community into teams, each with specific responsibilities. Dr. Chen and 2 nurses would maintain a field medical station in the root cellar, the most protected structure on the property. Jason and Howard would manage our power systems, ensuring critical equipment remained operational even if parts of our grid were damaged. Frank, Sarah, and 3 others formed our main defense team, armed with the limited weapons we possessed. I would coordinate everything from a central position in the barn loft, which offered visibility of the entire property while remaining relatively protected. Using a system of battery-powered handheld radios we'd salvaged from the fire station, we could maintain communications independent of our main power grid. Everyone received basic training in emergency procedures, defensive positions, and first aid. Even those who couldn't fight directly were given roles, monitoring radio frequencies, managing supplies, or caring for the most vulnerable patients. By the evening of the 3rd day, we were as prepared as possible. Now we could only wait and watch. The attack came at dawn on the 4th day, just as first light crept over the eastern hills. Our early warning system, a series of tripwires connected to small bells positioned half a mile out, gave us 15 minutes' notice. Everyone moved to their designated positions with practiced efficiency. From my observation point, I counted 8 vehicles approaching along the main road, more than we'd anticipated. Reynolds was committing significant resources to this operation, which confirmed my suspicion that he knew exactly what he was targeting. He wanted our power systems, our technical knowledge. He wanted me. The lead vehicle was a large pickup truck with a makeshift battering ram attached to the front, designed to break through our gate and any barriers beyond. 2 trucks followed with armed men in the beds, then several smaller vehicles bringing up the rear. Their formation was tactical, professional. Reynolds had clearly planned this carefully. As they approached our first line of defense, a fallen tree blocking most of the road, the lead truck slowed exactly as we'd hoped. When it navigated around the obstacle, it triggered our first disruptor. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The truck's engine died instantly. Electrical systems failed. The men inside scrambled out in confusion, unable to understand what had happened. The second truck, following too closely, had to swerve to avoid collision. It veered right, directly into the activation zone of our second disruptor. Like the first, it instantly went dead, rolling to a stop as momentum bled away. The remaining vehicles halted, their occupants clearly reassessing the situation. Through binoculars, I spotted Reynolds emerging from one of the rear vehicles, gesturing angrily. Even at this distance, I recognized his distinctive movement patterns, the way he commanded attention. He organized his men into a dismounted approach, abandoning vehicles to advance on foot. It was a smart adaptation, but one we'd anticipated. As they moved forward in a loose tactical formation, they triggered our secondary defenses, non-lethal traps designed to separate, confuse, and delay. Pit traps concealed with lightweight covering materials, tripwires connected to nets and snares, narrow passages that forced them to bunch up, becoming easier targets for our defenders. With each obstacle, their cohesion deteriorated further. Frank's team engaged selectively from prepared positions, using minimal ammunition to maximum effect, not aiming to kill, but to wound and demoralize. A man shot in the leg required others to help him, reducing the effective fighting force even further. After 30 minutes of increasingly disorganized assault, the attackers retreated to their remaining functional vehicles. They'd lost 4 trucks to our disruptors, had at least 6 men wounded, and had failed to penetrate even our outer defensive perimeter. As they withdrew, I caught Reynolds looking directly toward my observation post. Though he couldn't possibly see me through the concealed opening, I felt his recognition, his fury. This wasn't over. He would regroup, rethink, return with a new strategy. We used the respite to check for breaches, treat minor injuries among our defenders, and reset what traps we could. No one had been seriously hurt on our side, a minor miracle given the force arrayed against us. That evening, the council gathered to assess our situation. We'd won the first engagement decisively, but at a cost. We'd revealed some of our defensive capabilities. Reynolds now knew we had technological countermeasures he hadn't anticipated. He would adapt. We need to be proactive, Sarah argued. Take the fight to them before they regroup. Frank shook his head. Too risky. We're outnumbered, and moving outside our prepared positions negates our advantages. Dr. Chen added her concern. And we can't leave our patients undefended. We'd have to split our forces. I considered all perspectives, then offered a third option. What if we could eliminate their advantage without a direct confrontation? Strike at their resources rather than their people. Howard immediately understood. Their power. That's what gives them superiority, the ability to maintain vehicles, communications, weapons. Exactly, I confirmed. During reconnaissance, I identified their power source, diesel generators at the truck stop. If we could disable those, they'd be reduced to the same technological level as everyone else. No electric lights for night operations, no power tools for repairs, no refrigeration for food storage. How would we even get close enough? Jason asked. After today, they'll have doubled their security. I explained my plan. A small team moving at night, approaching through drainage channels that ran beneath the highway near their compound. We wouldn't attack directly. Instead, we'd introduce a contaminant into their fuel supply, water mixed with sugar, a simple combination that would render diesel fuel unusable and damage engines when attempted to be used. 2 people, I said. Maximum mobility, minimum risk. In and out before they know we were there. The council debated intensely. The plan was risky, but offered strategic advantages that might prevent another direct assault on our community. Eventually, they approved the operation with one condition. I wouldn't go alone. Sarah, with her hunting experience and knowledge of stealth movement, would accompany me. We prepared through the next day, gathering intelligence through long-range observation, planning approach and escape routes, preparing the contaminant mixture. By evening, we were ready. We moved out after midnight, traveling light, just weapons, night vision goggles salvaged from the fire station's emergency equipment, and containers of our engine-killing mixture. The 5-mile journey took hours as we moved carefully, avoiding roads and open areas. The truck stop came into view around 3 in the morning. As expected, Reynolds had posted guards, 2 men on the roof, others patrolling the perimeter, but their attention was focused outward, watching for a frontal approach. They hadn't secured the drainage channel that ran beneath the property. Sarah and I entered the concrete tunnel, wading through ankle-deep water, communicating only with hand signals. The channel emerged behind the main building, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. From there, we could see their fuel storage, 4 large tanks connected to pumps. 2 guards stood nearby, but they were talking, inattentive, confident in the outer perimeter security. We waited patiently for them to move, using the time to observe the compound. I counted at least 15 men, maybe more inside buildings. Their resources were impressive. Weapons, vehicles, supplies. Reynolds had built something substantial here. When the guards finally walked toward the main building, we moved quickly. Sarah provided cover while I approached the tanks. Each had an inspection port on top for measuring fuel levels and checking quality. I climbed carefully, opened the first port, and poured our mixture inside. Repeated the process with each tank. We were almost clear when a guard unexpectedly rounded the corner of the building. Sarah reacted instantly, dropping low behind a concrete barrier. I wasn't as fortunate, caught halfway between the tanks and cover. The guard raised his rifle, mouth opening to shout an alarm. I braced for the worst. Then, impossibly, he crumpled to the ground. Sarah stood behind him, a rock in her hand. She'd closed the distance silently and struck him unconscious. We bound and gagged him, hiding him behind the tanks, then retreated the way we'd come. By sunrise, we were halfway back to the farm, exhausted but successful. Our mission had been accomplished without alerting Reynolds or his people. The effects wouldn't be immediate. They'd continue using the contaminated fuel until it worked its way through their systems. Then gradually, their vehicles would fail, their generators would seize, their technological advantage would evaporate. We'd bought ourselves time, perhaps weeks before Reynolds could mount another serious attack. Time we desperately needed to strengthen our defenses, expand our resources, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation to come. As we approached the farm, I saw it with new eyes. Not just as a refuge, but as the beginning of something meaningful. In just over a month since the EMP, we'd built more than personal survival. We'd created a community based on mutual support, shared skills, and common purpose. For the first time since that flash of light in the prison basement, I felt genuine hope for the future. Not just hope for survival, but for rebuilding, for creating something better than what had been lost. The world had changed irrevocably. Perhaps we could change with it, preserving the best of what came before while discarding the worst. Perhaps the EMP, for all its destruction, had also given us an opportunity, a chance to rebuild with purpose and intention. These thoughts accompanied me as we made our final approach to the farm. Frank was waiting at the gate, rifle ready but lowered when he recognized us. "Successful?" he asked simply. Sarah nodded. Phase 1 complete. Phase 1. Because we all knew this was just the beginning. Reynolds and his group were just one thread among many in this new world. But we'd faced them, adapted, survived. We'd continue to do so, one challenge at a time. As dawn broke fully over the farm, illuminating the solar panels, the growing crops, the people beginning their daily tasks, I realized something profound. The EMP hadn't just changed the world. It had changed me. The prison electrician who'd survived those first chaotic days was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more purposeful. Someone who understood that true power wasn't about controlling electrical systems, but about building connections between people, about creating light in the darkness, both literally and figuratively. That understanding would guide everything we did going forward. The effects of our sabotage became apparent over the following days. Through careful observation from a distance, we witnessed Reynolds's group experiencing increasing mechanical failures. Vehicles abandoned by the roadside. Generator outages leading to darkened buildings at night. Their patrols became less frequent, more localized. Reynolds wasn't stupid. He'd eventually identify the sabotage and clean his fuel systems. But that would take time and resources. Time for us to strengthen our position. Resources he couldn't spare for other operations. We used this window of opportunity to implement Howard's expanded power system. With the batteries and components we'd salvaged, we doubled our electrical capacity. Critical systems received dedicated power circuits, the infirmary, communications, security. We even managed to set up a small refrigeration unit for medications and perishable food. Our community grew during this period as well. A family of 4 arrived, having traveled over 100 miles after their small town became unsustainable. The father was a carpenter, the mother a former agriculture extension agent with valuable knowledge about crop management and food preservation. Their teenage children quickly integrated into our work teams, eager to contribute. A week after our sabotage mission, we spotted a lone figure approaching the farm on foot. Through binoculars, I was shocked to recognize Cisco, my friend from the prison. He was thinner, weathered by weeks of survival, but unmistakably alive. I met him at the gate personally. "How did you find me?" I asked after our initial reunion. He smiled tiredly. "Followed the electricity. Not many places have working lights these days. Word spreads." His story was grim. The prison had descended into complete chaos after I left. Guards abandoned their posts as food ran out. Riots erupted. Many died in the violence. Cisco had escaped with a small group, but they'd been separated during an encounter with raiders. "Reynolds," I guessed. Cisco nodded. "He's building an empire out there, controlling territory, resources. Anyone with useful skills gets conscripted. Everyone else gets exploited or driven off." This confirmed our intelligence and amplified our concerns. Reynolds wasn't just a local threat. He was establishing regional control, expanding his influence. Our community was likely just one target among many. Cisco brought other valuable information as well. Military forces were regrouping in certain areas, establishing order where possible. Some critical infrastructure was being restored. Power in a few major cities, limited communications, transportation corridors. But these efforts were isolated, uneven. Large portions of the country remained in darkness, relying on local organization for survival. The council voted unanimously to accept Cisco into our community. His lock-picking skills proved immediately useful for salvaging operations, and his prison experience gave him unique insights into security vulnerabilities we hadn't considered. With Cisco's arrival, our population reached 23. We were no longer just surviving. We were becoming a functioning society in microcosm. Work teams operated with increasing efficiency. Resources were managed systematically. Medical care improved as Dr. Chen established proper facilities and procedures. We began thinking beyond immediate needs, planning for longer-term sustainability. Sarah organized hunting parties to stockpile preserved meat for winter. Frank expanded the greenhouse using salvaged materials to extend our growing season. Jason established a regular maintenance schedule for all vehicles and mechanical systems. I focused on expanding our power infrastructure and developing early warning systems. Using components from consumer electronics, motion sensors from security cameras, transmitters from wireless doorbells, I created a perimeter monitoring system that could alert us to approaching threats up to a mile away. Howard's condition improved enough for him to become more active in our planning. His knowledge of large-scale power generation systems became the foundation for ambitious expansion. Together, we designed a hydroelectric system using the creek that ran through Frank's property, small but consistent power generation that wouldn't depend on weather conditions like our solar and wind systems. On day 45 since the EMP, we received our first genuine outside communication. Jason had modified our ham radio with additional antennas and power amplifiers, expanding its range significantly. The transmission came from a military command post over 100 miles away. Brief, formal, but profoundly important. To all civilians receiving this transmission, the United States government continues to function. Regional recovery centers are being established. Infrastructure restoration is proceeding according to emergency protocols. Maintain your position if secure. If requiring evacuation, proceed to designated collection points. Further instructions will follow on this frequency at 0800 hours daily. The message repeated 3 times, then ended. We gathered in the main house to discuss its implications. "Should we respond?" Frank asked. "Let them know we're here?" Dr. Chen was cautious. What would we gain by identifying ourselves? They're not offering immediate assistance. Information, Howard argued. Coordination with larger recovery efforts. We can't rebuild society as 23 people on a farm. The debate continued until I offered a compromise. We listen, but don't transmit yet. Gather more information about these recovery efforts before revealing our position or capabilities. The council agreed. For the next several days, we monitored the military frequency religiously, compiling information about the broader situation. The picture that emerged was both encouraging and concerning. Central government functions had survived the EMP, protected in hardened facilities. Military command structures remained largely intact, though dispersed and operating with reduced capabilities. Recovery efforts were underway, focusing first on critical infrastructure, power generation, water treatment, transportation networks, communication systems. But these efforts were hampered by the scale of the disaster. Resources were concentrated in strategic locations, leaving vast areas to fend for themselves. Regional warlords, people like Reynolds, had emerged in the power vacuum, controlling territories through force. Civilian populations were either gathering in government-managed recovery centers under strict control or forming independent communities like ours. On day 48, our early warning system detected multiple vehicles approaching from the direction of Reynolds' compound. Our observers confirmed at least 6 trucks moving with purpose toward the farm. Despite our sabotage, Reynolds had recovered more quickly than anticipated. We activated our defense plan immediately. All non-essential personnel moved to protected shelters. Defense teams took their positions. The disruptors were armed and ready. But this time, something was different. The vehicles stopped well short of our outer perimeter, beyond the range of our disruptors. A single figure emerged from the lead truck, carrying a white flag. Through binoculars, I confirmed it was Reynolds himself. "He wants to talk," Frank said, lowering his rifle slightly. "What's your call?" Every instinct warned against trusting Reynolds, but rejecting parley outright would only guarantee continued conflict. Conflict we might not win if he had gathered enough forces for a determined assault. "I'll meet him," I decided, halfway between our positions. Sarah and Cisco for backup, concealed with rifles. Frank nodded grimly. "Be careful, this could be a trap." I approached the meeting point slowly, visibly armed, but with my weapon lowered. Reynolds watched my approach with that calculated expression I remembered from the prison, always measuring, assessing, looking for advantage. "Thorne," he called when I was within speaking distance. "Been a while." Prison treating you okay before everything went to hell? What do you want, Reynolds? You didn't come with a white flag to reminisce. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Direct as always. I'm here to propose an arrangement, an alliance of mutual benefit. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. You've got skills, infrastructure. We've got manpower, weapons. Together, we could control this entire region, build something significant. From what I've heard, your idea of building involves exploitation and force. He shrugged. I maintain order. Not everyone appreciates that, but it's necessary. The strong survive, the weak don't. That's the reality now. There are other realities, I countered. Cooperation, mutual support, building communities rather than fiefdoms. Reynolds laughed dismissively. Noble sentiments, but they won't keep you alive when the desperate masses come looking for what you have. You need protection. I can provide that. In exchange for what? Your technical expertise, your power systems, full integration of your community into my organization. There it was. Not an alliance, but an absorption. Not cooperation, but subordination. Reynolds hadn't changed. He'd simply recognized that direct assault was too costly. Not interested, I said flatly. We prefer independence. His expression hardened. Independence is an illusion, Thorne. The world's changed. Either you're with a group strong enough to protect what it has, or you're waiting to be victimized. There's no middle ground anymore. There's always middle ground for those willing to find it. Reynolds studied me for a long moment, then sighed. I respected you at the prison. You were smart, capable. Don't let idealism get your people killed. Think about my offer. I'll give you 48 hours. He turned and walked back to his trucks without waiting for a response. I watched them leave, mind racing with implications and possibilities. Reynolds' approach signaled both strength and weakness. He wanted what we had badly enough to negotiate rather than attack, but his resources weren't unlimited. By the time I returned to the farm, I had the outline of a plan, not just for dealing with Reynolds, but for our community's future in this changed world. A plan based on everything I'd learned in the 50 days since the EMP flash changed everything. That evening, I presented it to the council. Not an alliance with Reynolds, which would mean surrendering our values and independence. Not continued isolation, which would leave us vulnerable to future threats. But a third path, a network of independent communities linked by mutual support and shared resources. We contact other groups, I explained. Farms, technical experts, medical professionals, security specialists. Each maintains their independence but agrees to common defense and resource sharing. Together, we're stronger than Reynolds or any single group, but no one holds centralized control. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. A federation rather than an empire. Exactly. Reynolds isn't the only power emerged from the chaos. There must be others like us, groups trying to rebuild without exploitation, seeking cooperation rather than domination. Howard added his support. With proper coordination, we could even begin restoring larger infrastructure. Power distribution between communities, communication networks, transportation corridors. The discussion continued late into the night, exploring possibilities, addressing concerns, refining the concept. By morning, we had consensus. We would use our remaining time before Reynolds' deadline to reach out to other communities, to begin building our network. Over the next 2 days, we sent messengers in all directions, Jason in the fire truck to the north, Sarah on horseback to the east, Cisco and one of Frank's neighbors to the south and west. Each carried the same message, an invitation to form a mutual support pact against threats like Reynolds, to share resources and knowledge for rebuilding. As I stand here now, day 50 since the EMP changed everything, I don't know if our plan will succeed. I don't know if enough communities will join our federation to counter Reynolds's growing power. I don't know if the fragile sprouts of civilization we're nurturing will survive the harsh realities of this new world. But I know this: in the darkest moment of human history, we found light. Not just electrical light from our improvised power systems, but the illumination of hope, of community, of shared purpose. We discovered that while an EMP could destroy our technology, it couldn't erase the most important connections, those between people committed to helping each other survive and rebuild. The world that emerges from this catastrophe will be shaped by the choices we make now, in these critical days and weeks. Will we choose Reynolds' path of strength through domination? Will we surrender to centralized control in government recovery centers? Or will we forge a new way, communities linked by cooperation rather than subjugation, sharing resources and knowledge while preserving independence and dignity? I believe our answer to these questions will determine not just whether we survive, but whether survival is worth the cost. And as I look around at what we've built in these 50 days, at the community that came together against all odds, I'm convinced we're on the right path. The EMP took almost everything from us, but in doing so, it revealed what truly matters. Not the technologies we'd become dependent on, but the human connections that sustain us through our darkest hours. Not the systems that structured our old lives, but the values that guide us towards something better. Whatever comes next, whether Reynolds accepts our refusal peacefully or prepares for war, whether our federation of communities flourishes or falters, I know one thing for certain. The prison electrician who survived those first chaotic days has found something worth fighting for, something worth building, something worth believing in. And in a world gone dark, that might be the most powerful current of all.